why do you want to perform better? It sounds like an obvious question, right? Why do you want to perform better? Well, obviously, better performance is good, but that is not a motivator by itself. What kind of person will you be if you perform better? What will that lead to? What will that allow you to do? How will you feel about yourself when you perform better? That ultimately is the driver of change.
Hello guys, welcome back to another episode of Voices of Holt here in the London campus. Today's an extra special episode because I'm here with a new co-host, Larissa.
Hello everyone, I'm Larissa. I'm also a member of Voices of Holt marketing team, so it's very nice to be here.
Lovely, really excited to have another co-host. And also today's guest is highly requested. Very excited about this one. It is Director of Student Development and Professor of Psychology, Max.
Hello everyone, I'm not a member of the Voices of Holt marketing team, unfortunately.
So to start, we just wanted to ask a bit about your background. We know you have a background in sports and psychology, so tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I had a bit of a weird background coming into Holt. I think if you'd asked me when I was 16, 17, 18, if I thought I'd be working at university, I would have laughed at you and then gone back to doing things I shouldn't have been doing. But so I went into I always wanted to go into sport, and sport was kind of a really, really big thing for me. I wasn't very good at it, but I like playing it a lot. Mm-hmm. I did not get along well with academia. I hated school, really struggled, didn't want to do exams. It was not for me at all. So I went to university to do sports science. And got really lucky. Got an opportunity to go and do some stuff with a rugby club called Cathy Scarlets quite early on into my degree. At which point I kind of thought, well, what's the point of me doing a degree if I've already managed to get opportunities? The tricky thing was I spent a couple of months doing the job that I thought was going to be my dream job and absolutely hated it. The pay was absolutely terrible. No one listened to you. No one respects you. You're working like 12-hour days. And so I kind of at this point I was now outside of university, doing a job I didn't particularly enjoy, and every kind of idea that I'd had about what I wanted to do was gone. So I was in a bit of a tricky situation. So at the time, I was doing some work in sport. Basically, it was something called a performance analyst. So if you ever watch live sport and you see the statistics that come up on the side of the screen, my job was to work in-house for a rugby club to produce those statistics, to feed those back. So whilst that sounds kind of cool and interesting, what it meant is that I literally sat at the side of a rugby pitch with a laptop and would press buttons that indicated what was happening on the pitch. Because at the time, we didn't have good enough AI that could figure out what was actually happening. So I had to enter it all manually. Then I remember in my first week, I worked probably like 20, 30 hours overtime to pull together this presentation where I'd done like an analysis on something called like a line out in rugby. Done this massive analysis, presented it back to the head coach, and after a minute, he stopped me and walked off because he had another meeting, and I was like, oh. Okay, so at the time I was a bit stuck. I had an opportunity to work with a couple of my friends, setting up a business called The Depot in Cardiff. A guy called Nick Saunders, really, really cool guy, had this idea to turn an old glassworks into like an events venue. So I was part of a group that set that up. It was super fun. Was like building furniture out of like old pallets and old bits of wood. Ran that for a couple of years. I did a huge number of jobs while I went back to university. So I did things like I was a bingo caller. So I used to do the numbers at a bingo. That was good fun. There's some videos on the internet of that, which is interesting. I worked in a call centre. I did removals. I worked in an ice cream factory. Most of these I didn't last for very long, but the whole time I was doing that. I was working at the depot. Went back to university. Was still doing bits and bobs in sport. I did something called coach development for a while, which is basically working with. So if coaches work with their athletes to improve their performance, who works with the coach? And so that was my job for a little bit. Did some stuff with Team GB. So skeleton was really fun. Really enjoyed that. Helping support them before one of the Winter Olympics. Did various stuff around coach development with places like the RFU, so England Rugby, England Cricket. Really, really enjoyed it. But one of the things that I was doing there was I was doing stuff called a physiological analysis of HRV, heart rate variability. It's basically a way of looking at autonomic tone. basically from stuff that we'd done in my sports science. And then an opportunity came up a little while ago. This is probably in like 2016, I think, where we've got a part of Holt called Ashridge, where we do executive education. It's the beautiful castle that always gets thrown on the marketing material. It's a lovely place to go. But what we do there is we work with senior leaders on how they improve their performance. And so my job in sport had basically been, how do we help coaches? So where their performance is psychological, so is a lot of business. So we applied some of this technology into business, and where I ended up teaching was that my job at Ashridge was basically to go in, wire up senior leaders, so put like ECGs on them. They'd wear these monitors for like 5 days. Then I'd give them some feedback. So I'd explain like where stress was coming in, like how they could recover better, and ultimately how they could perform better. So I got asked to go to Saudi Arabia to go and do this. And my job at this point had literally been like administrative and feedback. So I'd give feedback. And then I got there, and the lead professor that was out there, a lady called Judith, I still don't know if she knows about this, so hopefully she doesn't see it. But when I got there, she sat me down in the hotel lobby, said, "Oh, great to meet you, lovely to see you," all this stuff. We chatted, and then she was going through the plan for the week, and she was like, "And so do you have an idea yet of what you're going to cover in your session on Friday?" And I was like, what? So I had two choices. I was either say to this lovely lady Judith, who'd done all this work and was super supportive of me being out there, say to her, "Sorry, I don't teach classes, like you've now got 3 hours in your schedule to fill," or "I've got 3 days to come up with like a class that I can teach to these senior leaders." It was a company called Sadara, the state-owned chemical company in Saudi, with some of the most senior people. So I was probably, 22, 23 at this time. To go back to this, so I was very, very nervous to do this session. So kind of winged it, got really good feedback. It went really, really well. So Ashridge invited me to come back and do more. That resulted in a couple of different jobs at Ashridge. So I worked in a department called experiential learning, which was basically, getting executives to learn through doing, something that I'm sure we're aware of at Hull.
Very typical.
Exactly right. And then I had a job in the psychometrics team, and then one of my favorite things ever happened, which was that Ronan asked me to come and do a guest lecture at Holt on sports. Did that guest lecture, and when I came to Holt, something that always got me was that the Ronan walked me in, and I will never forget this. I don't know if any of you guys met Ronan when he was the dean, but this was a couple of years ago. It's probably before you guys were here. He still works at Holt. He's now Global Director of Learning Development. He'd be a great guy to speak to. But as he walked me in, he walked me up to my classroom on 3B, and pretty much every single student he walked past, he knew their name. And I was like, that just didn't happen at my university. It barely even happened at my school. The students were a different level. I've done kind of like seminars and guest lectures at other universities, and one thing that's always struck me about students at Holt is that they are willing to be wrong, and they're willing to participate and be curious in a way that other students just aren't. So I had all this like experiential learning planned, and I was like, well, what if the students don't engage and they're just expecting a lecture? I came in and straight away they were ready to do it. They wanted to participate, and I was like, this is where I want to be. Like 100% this is where I want to be. So Ronan invited me back. Things went well. I committed full-time to Holt in 2019. I started teaching full-time. Opportunity with a new program came up, and then there was this opportunity to create coaching, and I was like, this is so cool. This is that kind of where we tie it all back in. They asked me to look after the coaching team in London, and that's where I've been ever since. I absolutely love it to bits. I feel so super lucky every day that I'm working here. Anyway, sorry for the ramble. That's kind of a bit of a brain dump.
That was needed. I have a question. At what point did you start the whole psychology background? Like in this entire journey, I heard psychology coming up at some point, but I want to know when did you decide that you wanted to go that route? So
what was interesting is that I tried to do a psychology A level, and I dropped it after a year because I hated it, because every time we talk about it, it was always stories of old white men and the experiments they'd done, right? And all we had to do is we weren't learning anything interesting about how people think or the way in which you learn. It was just, Bowlby said this and Skinner did this, and honestly, it was mind-numbing, so I dropped it. Didn't think anything of it. And then I noticed that working in sport and working with people, like everything that kept coming up wasn't about knowledge of theory and practice. It was about how do you get the most out of people, and how do you work with people, and how do people think. And I was like, well, I need to know more about this. So the work that I was doing with heart rate variability involved a lot of kind of brain science, and I'd done a lot of this informally, and I was like, I need to get formal qualification. So I went back to school after I'd been working full time for like a couple of years, and I did a master's in applied neuroscience based on kind of what I'd done in my undergraduate alongside I was working. I do not recommend it. It nearly broke me. I'm now doing my PhD in applied cognitive neuroscience. I remember when I applied for the course, I obviously listed my background. It was like sports science, working in sport, working with business, and I'd applied for this applied neuroscience course. And I had to do it. So normally you do one interview. I had to do 2 interviews because the first one, when they called me up saying, "Have you applied for the right course?" I had to be like, "No, this is why. This is what I've done. This is like my self-study." So that's super cool. Interviewed, luckily got a distinction in that. I did my master's thesis on something called dyscalculia. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's basically dyslexia, but with numbers. Looking at where that comes from. My PhD now is in how we respond to feedback in learning. So it's essentially like if you try and do something and you don't get the response that you want, how does your brain take that feedback, something we call incongruent feedback, and how does it actually create learning from it? Basically, how do we actually learn from mistakes? Because you hear everyone saying you learn more from failure than success, and it's great. Yeah, but how? What's happening in your brain? So that's what I'm interested in now. So psychology basically came from me realizing that it was more than just the experiments of old dead white men, and that it was actually about how do people think, how do people interact, and then my own self-study, and then I did get a formal qualification in my master's.
That's really nice. And speaking about neuroscience, you did an article about workplace stress. With the new program and the coaching tool that we have access now as students, how do you think that we could manage stress in that situation based on your study?
So that's super, super interesting question. And I think the reason why it's so interesting is because I think a lot of the time we get our idea of the word stress very wrong. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about stress, what we're talking about is we're talking about work being done by the body. And what people do is they tend to mix up the ideas of stress and pressure, right? Pressure being pressure is almost universally negative, right? You have people that say they perform well under pressure. It's a myth. So Michael Jordan he's talks about as this clutch shooter in basketball. As he said himself, he missed far more shots than he scored. But it's a story we tell ourselves about pressure that's important. So coming back to this idea of stress. So stress is then work being done by the body, right? The way that we can measure stress is that we look at activation of a part of the nervous system called your sympathetic nervous system. Basically, it's the unconscious part of your brain that just gets stuff done for you. Things like regulating your heart rate, regulating your blood pressure, releasing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This is what stimulates that. So stress is essentially the activation of that part of the nervous system. Now, what is super interesting about the implications for the classroom is that stress, in terms of increased activation of those stress systems in the body, it has a very different impact on your learning depending on what point it happens in the learning process. So with your learning process, you normally have 4 key elements to it. The first one is encoding. So encoding would be, as you're having an experience, your brain is kind of turning this into a memory. Like as we're doing right now, your brain is encoding the idea of being in this room, like what we're being said, how you're feeling. All of these things are encoded into memory. Some things aren't, some things you don't remember. But for the most part, when you learn, you have an initial point of encoding, which is when you're first introduced to a stimulus. After that, what you'll have is a process called consolidation. This is normally when you sleep. So, for example, if you're not recovering properly, if you're not taking time away from things, you tend not to remember over a long time. Great example of this is, have you ever crammed for an exam?
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of time getting as much information as you can. You don't get as much sleep, and then like 2 weeks after the exam, it's all gone. It's because what you've done is you've encoded information, but you haven't consolidated it. So you have encoding, consolidation. Then you have retrieval, which is bringing it back from memory and using it, and then updating. So what do you do when there's new information that contradicts what you've learned? So the reason why I say this is that stress at different points of that learning journey impacts your ability to learn differently. So stress will negatively impact your ability to learn at 3 points during that journey. It will negatively impact your ability to learn during consolidation. So for example, if you don't recover properly because you're stressed or because there's increased activation of the body, you don't recall as well. Really interesting is that stress at the moment of retrieval also negatively impacts long-term learning, which is why exams are such a bad idea, right? It's because you're trying to retrieve information in a high-stress environment, and all of the research that we've got in neuroscience says that is not the way you retain long-term memory. There is one point where stress is beneficial to the learning process, and that is at the moment of encoding. So let's think about this, right? Is if you think about some of the strongest memories that you have, right? They're normally like highly emotionally charged events, whether that be positive or negative. So that is also when your body is at its most stressed, right? It has its highest levels of activation. So what we can do is we can manipulate that by introducing stress at the moment of encoding. So this is why if you've had classes with me, and I don't think you guys have had that many classes with me, but I know, for example, Zayn, in the class that we do, one of the key things that I will do is try and get you standing up as an absolute minimum. Try and get you doing things and try and give you those experiences that involve some form of stress, because it's a really positive thing, not pressure. Pressure is different, but stress in terms of increased activation, you remember those things, right? One of the core classes that I do in core module 1 is the one around influencing, where what we could do is we could do it in a very sedate way, but I deliberately try and get everyone standing up and moving around to increase the stress levels within the body so that you encode things better. And that's why then reducing down the amount of stress when you have to retrieve that information is equally as important, right? Why we have lots of smaller assessments, because that way you actually retain information more. So how do you then, so I'm going to slightly change your question. So rather than managing stress, I would say, how do you use stress?
To
Right?
your advantage.
Exactly, yeah, superb. So it's not necessarily about managing your stress. I would say it's about managing pressure and managing the pressure that you feel on yourself, but stress is something you can use to your advantage. If you're learning new information, how are you doing that, right? Are you sitting down in a chair, not moving, not speaking to anyone? Are you actively engaging and having conversations about things, right? Because when you have those conversations, like right now, our stress systems, even though, at the start I was nervous, but I'm having a great time chatting to you both, our stress systems will be activated, right? Because in order for us to perform, we need that. So having conversations with people, talking about things, presenting information back, that's a way of increasing stress at the moment of encoding. Whereas if all you do is that you sit in class and you're passive, you let professors talk to you, you don't engage with things, that's one way to lower your stress levels, but it's not going to improve your learning. So putting yourself in situations where you're slightly uncomfortable, right? Maybe putting your hand up to give an opinion, right? When you don't necessarily know it's right, that provides stress at the moment of encoding. These are all things you can do. The more of an active participant you are in your own learning, the more you will learn. So it's not about how do we manage stress, it's about how do we use stress.
And how do you think the new program at Holtz kind of takes that lesson and puts it into practice?
So the idea with the new program was that everything should be based around doing something, right? And I think with the old program, one of the things that the old program had was that it had like tons of different courses. It's something that, you could have 2 different courses where one would be kind of exam based and it wasn't really around a challenge. Whereas one of the ideas with the new program was to really focus in on creating those experiences. But the problem is that, as we talked about, encoding is only one part of the learning process. So we could give you as many experiences as you liked, but without the rest of that learning process, you don't take anything away from it. So the idea with it was that we bring in the coaching team, right? So the whole idea of the coaching team is to focus on everything else that goes into the learning process. The idea being that you get adequate support. The idea being that you get adequate, like more of a holistic approach to your learning. So what do I mean by this? Well, there's a great quote from a powerlifter. It's a bit of a weird place to come from, but he talks about learning from experience, and he says a phrase that I use all the time, which is that experience is a great teacher, but only if you pay attention in class, right? And I really love that, right? Because there were senior leaders that I used to work with that had 30 years experience, but they were just as shit as their jobs as people that had come from graduate school. And the reason for that is because they'd had all this experience, but had done nothing to learn from that experience. no reflections, no engagement outside of just doing things. So events only become experiences through the interest that you take in them and the way in which you think about them and the way in which you reflect in them. And I think that one of the things that universities get wrong a lot of the time is that the vast majority of the stuff that you learn in university is not in the textbooks. No. It's what you learn about yourself. What are you good at? What are you bad at? What do you struggle with? What do you like? What do you want to do? How do you perform in social situations? How do you interact when there's an issue? How do you deal with conflict? Because that ultimately is the stuff that's going to make you really valuable. So knowledge is important, right? But I can tell you on one hand, right, the number of times that I've used like a Porter's 5 forces or something like that when making a decision. But the amount of times I've had to navigate conflict and collaborate with people that I don't necessarily agree with, like I've already done that twice today. And so this is what I mean. So those experiences and that learning that you have, the whole idea with the coaches was that we make sure, or we try and make sure, that experience doesn't just stay as an event, and we try and do more with it. But also outside of what you're doing in the classroom, how are you taking the learning from that as well? And how do we create an environment where you're good to learn? Because if you're having stress at all those other moments, right, outside the classroom when you're not encoding, if you have stress during consolidation and updating and all that stuff, again, you're not going to learn. And that comes from, for example, not feeling like you belong and not feeling like you've got community, like all these other different things. So that's where the kind of the idea of coaching came from as well.
And what were the main challenges in implementing the new program? I think because it's something very new, we were not used to it. What did you guys go through, and how did you learn from it?
Turn the cameras off quickly.
I mean, everything comes with a challenge, I feel.
Everything comes with a challenge. Yeah. So change management is always an incredibly difficult process, no matter how small the change, how big the change. So I'm just thinking about what I should and shouldn't say.
How do you say? We were like the new ones. We were the first ones. So we kind of got the experience of we're trying everything out. I remember we used to get surveys every single time we finished the first one core module, because it was the first time they ever ran a core module. So we would have to give feedback. And I did see, I remember the first core module, there was a quiz every week. Yes. On things that we had to, we were learning in class, and I was taking notes like crazy because this is gonna be in the quiz. And then I remember a lot of people took that as so much stress, and they were more worried about writing things down on their notes, so they took that away.
So that was the thing, right? Is that we put those quizzes in as the low stakes retrieval, so you weren't stressed, and it had the opposite impact where everyone ended up so stressed. So we were like, shit, this is not working. So I tell you what, rather than talking about the main challenges, I'll tell you what I've learned from managing this process, just because I think that's probably less likely to get me in trouble. So I think what I've learned about the change process is that if you want to be successful in managing a major change like that, the first thing you need to do is you need to have agents of change, people that are actually bought into it, and you need to have them in the right positions. And if you don't have those, you need to really question why. And I think that's something that we probably didn't do enough of, right? Is that I think that a lot of the people that are involved in making the change, I think the big error that we made is we made assumptions about what people thought. And that's dangerous, right? People always say that, you've heard that really annoying phrase, when you assume, you make an arse out of you and me, right? Assumptions are very good things, because if you wait till you've got all the data to make a decision, you will never make a decision. So you have to make assumptions. The problem is that you have to be aware of where your assumptions are, and that they are assumptions. And I think that one of the things that we probably got wrong is that we assumed that everyone knew why we were making these changes, what we were doing them for, right? Like as students, did you know why we had all those quizzes? Did you know the pedagogy behind it? Did you know the reasoning for it?
I don't think so.
Well, I mean, my high school experience was I did international A-levels and APs.
Okay, nice. Yeah.
So I did them both at the same time, and it was basically all like that. I remember for my international A-levels, they gave me a spreadsheet of every single question they've given before in the previous years, all the right answers, and I had to memorize the right answers because they were going to give me the same questions but with a different context. So I knew exactly what words to use. So I would memorize the answer and just put it with context of what I learned. So that was like my learning strategy for so long. So I kind of implemented that into the quizzes of like, I have to memorize this sentence because that sentence will probably be on the quiz.
Right, and so
Yeah.
here's a really interesting thing. So it's such an interesting point. We're going to go on a bit of a diversion. I'll come back to the change management stuff. But
okay.
what you've talked about there is it's really interesting, and it's another probably mistake that we made to some extent. There's a psychologist, a guy called Jean Piaget. Super interesting. He did loads of stuff on the kind of psychology of learning and early childhood development. He's a really, really interesting guy if you're interested in some of that stuff. He also has, I don't know if, can you be Jamie, pull it up if we've got it on, I'm going to show you pictures. If you can show a picture of Jean Piaget's office, it's spelled, his name is Jean, it's Jean, and his surname is Piaget, Piaget. Search a picture of him in his office. It is chaos. Like complete carnage. He's this tiny little man. He's like 5 foot, and he's just surrounded by papers everywhere. Anyway, I'll show you at another point. Yeah, there he is. Look at him.
Oh.
Chaos, right? And this is one of the best thinkers in terms of learning. And so one of his key ideas is that students are not empty vessels, or no one is an empty vessel. Like everyone comes into learning environments with their own biases, their own backgrounds and things like that. And I think that one of the things that we did is we assumed that when you come here, well, we can just tell you a little about the program, we'll post some resources, and then you'll then, oh, this is what it is. Mm-hmm. Whereas you've had that learning background, and I don't know if you've had a very different one, right?
Yeah, I had a very similar learning background, actually. You know, it's not very different from what I used to, but it's still a bit. So yeah, I think that was mostly for me, it made me feel, it was something familiar.
Right, exactly. And so we assumed with some people that it was going to be familiar and all this stuff, but for others it was completely alien, right? And that's where that stress comes from. Mm-hmm. So I think we made that big error of assuming that we would just post a few resources and people would understand exactly why we're doing what we're doing. So that was a big error. So making sure that people were bought in, that was the first one. I think the second one, something we did really, I think something we got right was being willing to be wrong.
I was going to say yes, because there was so many surveys that I saw the change when we would speak out and be like, I don't know if this worked out.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the really important thing, because ultimately you are the people that matter, right? We can have as many opinions as we like as staff, as faculty. Mm-hmm. But ultimately what matters is your experience and have you learned. And so I think that we absolutely could have done more of that, right? But I think that one of the things we got right was really pushing to listen to how are students experiencing this? Are they learning? And what do they think? And more importantly, how can we change that as a result? So that's something I think we got right. And if you want any tips about change management, that would be the first one, is be willing to be wrong and listen to that feedback. The third thing that I would say is that if you're going to make a change, you have to commit to it with full resources. And what I mean by that is that I think it's easy when you make the assumption that people are bought into a change, that they have the resources and the ability to do it. And I think that there's a phrase called we're building the plane as we fly it. You'll hear a lot in startups and things like that. And I think that in that first year we were very much doing that. Where we were kind of trying to pull resources from all over the place. And if I'm being completely honest, I think we could have benefited from maybe saying, hey, we haven't got the resource yet to do this. Let's postpone, let's push back. But then the issue is it comes from a good place, right? It comes from people wanting to do the right thing and wanting to be involved in all this stuff. And so we're like, right, let's go. Well, I think we can, let's do it. And I think that in reality, we probably could have benefited from being like, actually, let's be a bit more conservative here, because as we're made to do, but it's people are here because they genuinely believe in that, right? It's like, if I was still working in executive education, you can make like double my hourly rate like in a day working with a client, but it's not fulfilling. It's not engaging. It's not, you don't, I look forward actively to coming to work and seeing people, right? I absolutely love my job. Every single coach that you see up there is there because they're genuinely passionate about it, right? If you're doing executive coaching, you can make about £200 an hour. Not that, and that's just money to you in an executive coaching session. You'll normally do like 5 of those in a day. Yeah. Suddenly you're making like £1,000 a day, and it's easy work, but it's not fulfilling. is there is a difference between doing, you know, a 6-week block with an executive and seeing a student grow and develop over 3 years. It's incredible. I had a moment this at graduation, and sorry, this is a complete tangent again. I do apologise.
It's okay.
I had a moment. Graduation is always my favourite day of the year. And there was a moment this year, and I'm going to give him a shout out to our man Amro. But at graduation this year, we had a student I taught in his very first class, a kid called Amro Hatahat. And I taught him in like 3 or 4 different classes over the years. I saw him grow up. This is one of the things that you absolutely love, is you see students come in first year and they're still teenagers. They just come from school. They're still kids, and they leave as adults, right? You actually see people grow up and grow and develop in a way that you just don't do. And Amro, I've been working with Amro a lot, and he's an interesting character. But when he was coming up onto the stage, he got his name read out, and then he ran over and gave me a hug on the stage. And like there is nothing in the world more fulfilling than seeing the impact of the work you do. It's one thing I've actually really struggled with, is not teaching as much anymore, is that when you're teaching, you see that direct impact, and then working more in the administration, you get to have more impact, but it's not as visible. Sorry, I don't know why I ended up on that. That was a bit of a diversion.
Okay.
Apologies.
That was good.
I feel like as students, we feel very safe having the coaches. Usually in school, we don't really know who to talk to, you know, about certain topics and everything. And I think having a coach that follows us from the first year until graduation, it's a very helpful tool.
Well, that's the idea, right? Sorry, go on, Lucia.
No, we're in 3 minutes left, and I have one more last question. But finish off your thought.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say that I think that there's always things we can do better. There's always things we can get right, and I've still got lots of ideas about how to improve the coaches and their support, and there's a few other bits and bobs, especially. Anyway, I'll chat to you after.
Well, to finish off this episode, I have one more question for you, and it's basic. Do you want to read it? Do you want to do the honors?
Go ahead.
Okay. So basically, what's one small change that students can make today to improve their stress resilience and performance?
So I used to ask a very similar question to executives, right? And what I would say to them is that what is the smallest thing you can do that will have the biggest impact on your performance? And that ultimately is the question. There's not one thing that what every single student should do in order to improve their performance. It is going to be highly individualized. So the reason why I say this is that the one tip that I would give to everyone is to find out more about yourself and how you perform. So what I mean by that is that I work with leaders, and 9 times out of 10 it was things like sleep or hydration that were getting in their way of adequate stress responses. Basically, they wouldn't sleep properly. That would impact their ability to use stress systems in the right way the next day. They wouldn't be thinking as clearly, all that stuff. What impacted their sleep 9 times out of 10 was different for every single person. So the best thing that you can do is gather data on yourself, right? Try things out. So for example, try out a sleep routine for a week. See how you feel. Note things down. But what we do so often is we let our brain do the hard work, and we're never conscious about it. So if you're being conscious about, right, I'm going to try training in the morning, right? Obviously, don't do that. It's psychopathic. I don't understand why anyone would do that. But try things out, like set yourself a hydration target for the week. See how you feel. Are you more productive? But make notes on it, right? So often we let our kind of subjective thoughts about things get in the way of the actual objective data. Did we feel more productive? But that's the thing, is figure out what is the big thing for you, and just do that consistently. There's a brilliant model of behavior change that looks at the 3 things that drive behavior. And the first one is capability. So do you have the data about yourself to make the right changes? The second is opportunity. So how is your environment structured to make those changes? So for example, if you think that going to the gym is important, then do you make it easy to go to the gym, or is your gym 45 minutes out of the way and you have to go home and get changed, all that stuff? And the last one that I think people forget about the most is, why do you want to perform better? It sounds like an obvious question, right? Why do you want to perform better? Well, obviously, better performance is good. But that is not a motivator by itself. What kind of person will you be if you perform better? What will that lead to? What will that allow you to do? How will you feel about yourself when you perform better? That, ultimately, is the driver of change.
Well, Love it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun.
Thank you for coming. This
It's
was
my pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
And to finish off, what is one question that you're going to leave for our next speaker?
So I'm going to find out who the next speaker is before, and I'm going to ask them a really really tricky question, depending on who they are. But if it's a generic question, what I'm going to say is, if Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story doesn't know he's a toy, why doesn't he speak when humans are around?
wow.
Okay.
There you go.
That's deep.
That is deep. It is deep. Good luck answering that one. What was the previous person's question for me? Which was theirs?
It was basically, well, we haven't had guests for a long time.
Okay.
We kind of took a break, so this was kind of prepared from us.
Okay.
But we're keeping the cycle going
That's
from now
fine.
on.
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let me know who it is. I'll figure out a devilish question for them.
Lovely. Well, yeah. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Thank you so much.